Hercule Poirot and the Empty Cradle. In the Locked Room, Chapter 1, The Empty Cradle. The storm had descended on the Wiltshire countryside like a heavy hand, darkening the evening sky with thick clouds. Lightning flashed across the horizon like fiery knives, briefly illuminating the towering silhouette of Manor Lacey, an 18th-century mansion known more for its lineage than its warmth. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Mrs. Helena Farnley, heiress to the estate and wife of parliamentarian Charles Farnley, descended the stairs of the East Wing with the stiff gait of someone afraid to confirm an unspeakable suspicion. Her dark blue dress clung to her sweat-damp skin, and her eyes, fixed on the oak door of the nursery, unblinking. Inside the room, an oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls papered with pastoral scenes. The white crib, adorned with hand-sewn lace, lay motionless in the centre, and empty. Helena let out a dry sound, barely a whisper. In the rocking chair next to the crib, a porcelain doll, with the baby's dress carefully placed over her fragile, inert body. "Charles!" Helena cried. "Charles! The crib is empty!" The man came running from the library, his face pale and his coat still open. He took in the scene, and for a moment froze. Then he turned on his heel and shouted toward the stairs. "Call the police!" Now, 20 minutes later, as the clock in the entrance struck 8:20, the local inspector, the robust and sceptical Inspector Granger, examined the room with his assistant. "All the windows are locked from the inside," the officer said, checking the metal latch on the only opening to the outside. "There's no sign of forced entry." "And the door? Locked from the inside?" "Mrs. Farnley used her own key to open it. No one else comes in here since the wet nurse left the baby at 6. Granger frowned. Her gaze scanned the empty crib, the doll, and then settled on a mantelpiece where a silver rattle and an unopened letter rested. "Who else lives in the house?" he asked. "Besides the couple, there are 3 people. Mr. Farnley's brother, Nigel, who is visiting, the lady's cousin, Amélie Lemoine, who has lived here since she was a child, and, of course, the servants, the cook, the nanny, and the butler. Too many people for a closed room, don't you think?" The assistant didn't respond. Granger snorted and lowered the open letter. Its contents were bland. A congratulatory note on the birth of a child. No fingerprints, no leads. An impossible crime. The next morning, when the newspapers began to rumour about the empty cradle in the sealed room, a black car pulled up to the entrance of Manor Lacey. From inside, a man of modest stature but imposing presence descended. His moustache was a monument of symmetry, and his shoes shone like mirrors. He carried a small suitcase and a gaze that never missed a detail. "Messieurs, dames," he said with a slight nod as the butler opened the door for him. "I am Hercule Poirot. I've been told something peculiar happened here." Charles Farnley went towards him urgently. "Monsieur Poirot, I am infinitely grateful that you have come. The local inspector has no theory to explain this." "And you have any suspicions, monsieur?" asked Poirot, looking at the crooked picture frames in the hall. "I don't know. I don't want to think that someone close. That someone in this house? Ah, but it is always so, monsieur. In truly baffling crimes, the proximity is the key." Poirot was led to the baby's room. He paused just before entering. His gaze scanned the doorframe, the edges of the floor, the hinges of the lock. He entered cautiously, as if afraid of disturbing the very air. Then he looked at the crib, the doll, and the shelf where the rattle lay. "A crime without witnesses," he murmured. "A locked room, an empty crib, and a doll taking its place." Helena, who had entered silently, covered her mouth. "Do you think the child is dead?" Poirot turned to her with an almost compassionate "Look, madame, I don't believe, I observe, I deduce, and eventually I will know." Poirot walked to the window and ran a finger over the latch. "Sometimes, madame, the most impossible crimes are sustained by the simplest logic, only disguised as emotion." As he said this, his eyes fell upon a small spot on the window-sill. Tiny, almost imperceptible, but for Poirot it was a seed. The mystery had begun. Chapter 2. The Inhabitants of Manor-Lacy. Hercule Poirot sat with the poise of a Roman emperor in the mansion's library, where bookshelves lined the walls, and a discreetly lit fire barely mitigated the dampness of the air. Opposite him, Charles Farnley shifted nervously in his armchair, his fingers interlaced and his forehead beaded with sweat. His wife, Helena, sat a little further away, her eyes fixed on an untouched cup of tea. "Who was in the house last night, Monsieur Farnley?" Poirot asked gently, as if offering a courtesy rather than an inquiry. Charles cleared his throat. "Besides Helena and me, there was my brother Nigel. He arrived 2 days ago from Edinburgh. Helena's cousin, Amélie Lemoine, also lives with us. She's been here since she was 10. Then, of course, there's the domestic staff, Mrs. Hargreaves, the cook, Grace, the nanny, and Pellington, our butler." Poirot nodded slowly, recording each name with methodical accuracy. "And anyone else? Some guest, unexpected visitor?" "No one. And the gate locks at 8. No one can get in without Pellington searching them." "And the nanny? Where was she when the incident was discovered?" "Grace had left the room at 6. She said the baby was already asleep and that she checked the window and door latches. Helena went to check on the child at 8 and found that." Poirot turned to Helena. "Madam, was the door closed?" "Yes. We always lock it. We keep the key in a small tray on the console in the hall, right next to the door, and last night it was there. It wasn't missing." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "And you took the key from the tray yourself?" "Yes. No one else had any reason to. I saw the doll dressed in the baby's outfit, and I knew something was terribly wrong." The detective stood up slowly. "Could you show me that tray?" Mrs. Farnley led him into the hallway, where a dark wooden console table held an empty vase and a silver tray. Inside rested several keys, all labelled with small ivory rectangles. Poirot inspected the edges of the tray. His index finger rested on a small, barely perceptible indentation. He murmured. "This key has been tampered with more times than would be appropriate for a peacefully sleeping key." Suddenly, a cheerful voice interrupted the silence in the hallway. "Oh, you must be the famous Belgian detective. I've heard whispers about you, as if the mere mention of your name would solve mysteries." Era Amélie Lemoine. Slim, with dark hair tied back in a tight bun, Amélie had a sharp smile and eyes too attentive to appear naive. "Delighted, mademoiselle," said Poirot, inclining his head slightly. "Could you please tell me how you learned of the child's disappearance?" Helena screamed. "We all heard it. I was in my room, reading. I went downstairs immediately. Charles had already called the police. And your brother, Mr. Nigel? He came downstairs next, with an expression like, well, I can't describe it. Like he knew something bad was going to happen. Suspicious? I don't know, Monsieur Poirot. Nigel is a strange man. Sometimes he seems to walk around in a cloud." Poirot looked at Amélie for a moment longer. Then he nodded. "And the staff? Was it complete?" Pellington was in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal. Grace, the nanny, had already left. The cook, well, she's usually in her own world. Poirot returned with Charles and Helena. "I'd like to speak with Miss Grace, if possible." Helena nodded. Shortly after, the nanny appeared in the library. She was a young woman, sweet-looking, but visibly upset. "Mr. Poirot, I don't know what happened, I swear. I left the baby asleep. I checked the window, as usual. I locked the door and put the key back in its place. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary in the room?" Grace shook her head. "No, sir. Everything was in its place. Although, now that you mention it, the hanging mobile over the crib, one of the little figures wasn't turning. I fiddled with it to adjust it. I thought it was nothing but—" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "The teddy bear. It always spins at the slightest breeze. Last night it seemed stiff." Poirot remained silent. Then he murmured, "A teddy bear that won't turn. A doll that's in a place it doesn't belong in. An empty crib. And a key that's been touched more times than it should have." He looked up at Charles. "Sir, may I speak to your brother?" "Of course. You'll find him in the greenhouse. He likes to sit there in the evening." "Perfect. Plants, sir, rarely lie, unlike humans." And with slow but precise steps, Poirot headed towards the greenhouse. Because among the orchids and ferns, perhaps, someone had let slip more than they intended to hide. Chapter 3. Man Among the Plants, the Manor. Lacey Conservatory was a majestic structure of wrought iron and glass, with a tropical feel that contrasted with the damp chill of the rest of the house. A soft, humid warmth enveloped the room, and the scent of wet earth, mixed with the perfume of orchids, created an almost unreal atmosphere. Hercule Poirot walked slowly along the flagstone path, observing the precisely arranged flower boxes and the shelves overflowing with ferns and carnivorous plants. At the far end, sitting at a cast-iron table, a thin, middle-aged man with a wandering gaze and distracted expression was holding a glass of sherry he hadn't even touched. "Monsieur Nigel Farnley," Poirot greeted him courteously. "I beg your pardon for interrupting." Nigel looked up and forced a smile. "There's nothing to interrupt. The noise in this house has become unbearable since last night. You're the detective, I suppose?" Poirot nodded and sat down opposite him, without waiting for an invitation. He carefully removed his gloves and folded them in his lap. "Mr. Farnley, there's a missing baby, a locked room, and many people claiming to know nothing. You've been here for 2 days. Did you notice anything that might seem significant to you now?" Nigel toyed with the rim of his glass. Significant? What a strange word. Sometimes everything important seems trivial, and the trivial urgent. Poirot didn't press. He waited. After a few seconds, Nigel continued. "You see, My brother and I don't talk much. We never did. He inherited the house, the name, the fortune. I inherited the shadow. I came out of courtesy and curiosity. The child, the heir. How ironic. Will you get to the point, monsieur? Nigel laughed briefly, humorlessly. It's fine. The night before the incident, I saw something strange. It was almost 10 o'clock. I was smoking by the large window in the East Wing corridor. I saw a figure, a shadow more like, cross silently from the service wing towards the main staircase. It didn't look like a staff member to me. He walked as if he was avoiding making a sound. Could you recognize her? No, too dark. But she was tall, taller than Amélie or Helena. She didn't carry a flashlight. She walked like someone who knew the house very well. Poirot frowned slightly. And you didn't mention this to anyone? It didn't seem important to me then. It is now, of course. And how did the staff behave in general? Did you notice any tension or whispered conversations? Nigel leaned forward. The nanny. I've seen her come out of the servants' wing crying more than once. And the butler, Pellington, well, he has a strangely protective relationship with Amélie, like he's overly caring for her. Why? There are no answers yet, monsieur, only questions and shadows. Thank you for your time. Poirot stood up and nodded goodbye. As he walked away from the greenhouse, his mind replayed everything he'd heard with mathematical precision. A tall figure, a tampered key, a motionless doll, a nervous nanny, and a doll dressed like a missing child. Back in the lobby, he found the butler waiting for him with the discretion of someone who always knows more than he lets on. Monsieur Poirot, Pellington said in a neutral voice, would you like some refreshments? The kitchen is at your disposal. In a moment, sir. Could you tell me if anyone else has a copy of the key to the baby's room? Just Mrs. Farnley and Nanny. I keep duplicates in the key box, locked and with exclusive access. But no one has been reported missing. And you, Mr. Pellington? Where were you last night between 7 and 8? The butler blinked calmly. Preparing. The night tray in the kitchen, like every night. Mrs. Hargreaves can confirm that. Did you notice anything unusual? Any unusual behaviour? Mademoiselle Amélie seemed restless. She said she couldn't sleep. She paced the south wing corridor several times. Thank you. One last question, sir. Would you say Mr. Nigel gets along well with his brother? Pellington hesitated for only a moment. Cordiality, sir, although I've always felt that Monsieur Nigel lives with an unhealed wound, perhaps hereditary. Poirot nodded, then turned away. Thank you, sir. Your answers have been discreet instructions to the ear of a mystery. Back in his guest room, Poirot sat down with his notebook. He opened a blank page and wrote, Locked room, illusion of control or sign of manipulation. Dress doll, symbolic or distraction. Night movements, tall figure familiar from the house, man, Pellington, Nigel. Emotional motive, jealousy, inheritances, crossed loyalties. And the most disturbing detail, why did the doll stop spinning? He closed the notebook. It's too good to be a mistake, he murmured. When a clue is invisible, it's because it's been carefully hidden. Outside, the storm was returning. The wind tapped the windows like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the house, someone knew what had happened in that closed room. and Hercule Poirot was approaching. Chapter 4. Echoes in the Cradle. The next morning brought a pale sun that barely managed to dissipate the humidity of the previous day. Lacy Manor seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls knew there was still much to be revealed. Poirot ate breakfast alone, as usual. Strong coffee, lightly toasted bread, and half an apple carefully cut into perfect segments. Everything in its place, everything under control. But the crime, he thought, was not ordered. It was the consequence of the internal disorder of the soul. When he'd finished, Poirot asked to see the baby's room again. This time he was accompanied by Grace, the nanny. Her eyes still showed signs of the previous night's crying, and her voice, when answering the detective's questions, was a whisper filled with suppressed anguish. "Could you, mademoiselle, show me exactly how you left the room before leaving that afternoon?" asked Poirot, following her into the room. Grace paused beside the empty crib, as if afraid to look inside again. The child was sleeping. I tucked him in, checked the window latch, and went out. The door stayed locked as always. I put the key back in the locking tray without thinking. It was routine. Like every day, Poirot silently scanned the room. The walls were covered with children's drawings, animals, clouds, and stars. The mobile was still hanging over the crib, although one of the strings was a little tauter than the others. He approached. "Was this phone touched after you adjusted it last night?" Grace shook her head. "No, sir. At least, I didn't do it." Poirot watched him closely. The bear, which had supposedly remained motionless, had the rope slightly slack, and when he tugged lightly, the spring responded with a slight squeak. Click a trap, Poirot thought, or a mechanism that had no reason to be there. He bent down and examined the wooden stand holding the phone. Then he noticed something else. A thin strand of white thread wrapped around one of the screws. "Funny," he whispered. Grace looked at him carefully. "Does that mean anything?" Poirot straightened his back. "Everything means something, mademoiselle, even things that seem to mean nothing." Back in the corridor, Poirot found Helena walking with slow, distracted steps. She was carrying a book, but she clearly wasn't reading it. Her eyes were fixed on nothing, as if waiting for a sign from heaven. "Madam," Poirot greeted him politely. "Would you mind joining me for a moment?" She nodded wordlessly and followed him to the music room, one of the least used rooms in the house. Once there, Poirot closed the door. "Forgive me for being blunt, madame, but I must ask you something delicate. Were you afraid for your son?" Helena shuddered. "Fear for him? Why would I?" "Because sometimes the danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes it lives under the same roof." Helena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "I wasn't afraid for my son. I was afraid for my marriage." Poirot watched her silently, inviting her to continue. Charles, he didn't want the child, not the way he should have. He wanted an heir, yes. But he was also afraid. He believes in bloodlines, in secrets that are passed down like furniture. His family isn't clean, Monsieur Poirot. There are stories, madness, violence, buried things. And you, I wanted to protect the baby from all of that. even from its own father if necessary. Poirot leaned forward a little. "Do you think your husband would be capable of—" Helena shook her head. "No, not Charles, but someone else, someone who also knows." Poirot waited. "Amélie." The word came out almost in a whisper. "She was like a sister to me, but lately she's changed. She started saying strange things, as if she knows secrets I don't know myself. And she looks at the child, as if she sees something beyond him. Resentment, perhaps? I don't know. But there's something else, something about the way he speaks, as if he was waiting for something terrible to happen." Poirot stood up, grateful. "Thank you, madam. It has been enlightening." That afternoon, Poirot asked to see the correspondence log for the previous 2 weeks. Pellington, always efficient, handed him a folder containing envelopes and copies of letters sent and received. As he was leafing through the pages, an envelope caught his eye. Not because of its contents, which were bland, but because of its address. To Miss Amélie Lemoine. He came from a private psychiatric hospital in Sussex. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Pellington, do you know if Mademoiselle Amélie has any close relatives?" "Only his mother, sir. Died 3 years ago. The rest, not that I know of." Poirot slowly turned the envelope over in his fingers. So, why a letter from a psychiatric hospital? The skein tangled, but each thread, Poirot thought, had a specific tension. One of them would inevitably lead to the core. And that core was getting closer and closer. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Amélie. The rain had returned to Manor-Lacy that evening, beating on the windows with an irregular rhythm that seemed like a coded conversation between heaven and earth. Hercule Poirot walked along the south wing corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, guided by the constant murmur of his mind. The questions were beginning to align themselves. And the name that came up with increasing frequency was not that of the father, nor that of the butler, but that of Amélie Lemoine. He found her in the conservatory, sitting in front of a closed piano, her legs crossed, a half-empty glass of sherry at her side. She was wearing an emerald green dress that contrasted with her pale skin, and she was playing with an antique medallion hanging from a silver chain. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, without looking at him, "are you here to question me formally, or to inquire elegantly?" Poirot smiled gently. "With you, mademoiselle, one can only proceed with tact. Some secrets prefer dancing to confrontation." She turned slowly, her dark eyes fixed on him. "Then let's dance." Poirot sat delicately on the sofa opposite her. He waited a moment, letting the silence do its work. "Mademoiselle, I'm intrigued by your story. You came to this house as a child. You grew up here, and yet something in your eyes tells me you never felt a part of it." Amélie laughed, but without joy. "A distant cousin, a permanent guest, a shadow between the rooms. Yes, monsieur, I've heard all the versions. Helena loved me like a sister. Charles tolerated my presence, and I, well, watched." "You observed what?" "The deterioration," she replied. "The deterioration of the Farnley name. The deterioration of his supposed greatness. The madness of a closeted uncle. The hidden debts. The arranged marriages to maintain a facade. And now a child. A new hope, they say. But I only see the repetition. Poirot examined her carefully. A repeat. Of what? She didn't respond immediately. Then she held up the medallion. This belonged to my mother. She was institutionalized when I was 6. They said she heard voices, that she talked to people who weren't there. She never came home, but she wrote me letters that told me I would hear them too, someday. A thick silence fell between them. Poirot maintained his composure, but his mind was assessing with surgical precision. And you listened to them, mademoiselle? She stared at him. Not the voices, but yes, the repetition. Fate. Do you believe in that, Monsieur Poirot? I believe in patterns of human behaviour, not in fate, mademoiselle. How convenient, she murmured. Rationalism as a refuge. I don't have that luxury. Poirot leaned forward. A letter arrived for you recently, from the hospital where your mother was. Amélie tensed. For a second, her face showed a mixture of fear and fury. Did you read it? No, but its existence speaks volumes to me. Did you expect it? She nodded slowly. Yes, they sent me the final report. My visits ended a month ago. My mother died there, quietly. No one noticed, no one mourned, not even Helena. Did you hold a grudge against him? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It's a pendulum, like everything here. It swings between love and resentment. But the baby, it wasn't his fault. Poirot clung to that phrase. Didn't have. Why speak in the past tense? Amélie blinked. Then she smiled with a disconcerting melancholy. I don't know. I guess I'm still not used to disappearing. Did you know that the crib mobile had a loose thread and a tampered mechanism? This time, the reaction was clear. A blink. A subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth. I didn't know that. Did you enter the room that afternoon? No, I swear. But you know every corner of this house well. Right. Too well, monsieur. Poirot stood up gently. Thank you, mademoiselle. It was enlightening. Do you consider me a suspect? I consider everyone something, mademoiselle. But you, I watch you with particular attention. That night, as the wind rustled the treetops and the clock struck 11, Poirot wrote in his notebook, Amélie. Complex emotional motivation, not financial. Ambivalence with the child. Intimate knowledge of the house. Access. Possible opportunity. A state of mind on the border between lucidity and obsession. Simulation or real inheritance. The baby wasn't to blame. Key phrase. Regret or veiled confession. Poirot closed the notebook with a sharp click. Too many truths mixed with ghosts, he said softly. But the culprit isn't a ghost. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. The truth, like a loose cell phone string, was about to go taut. And when it did, it would reveal what everyone was pretending not to see. Chapter 6. The Voice of Those Who Are Silent. Dawn brought an almost unnatural silence to Manor Lacey, as if the mansion, on the verge of overflowing with unspoken secrets, had decided to hold its breath. Poirot rose before the sun touched the first windowsill, already dressed and with his moustache perfectly aligned. He didn't need any more clues. He needed to listen, but not to the guilty ones, to the invisible ones, to those who never spoke, to those who, were there, but they went unnoticed. At 7 o'clock sharp, he asked to speak with Mrs. Hargreaves, the cook, a sturdy woman, her face hardened by years of oven and fire, and with eyes that seemed to have seen everything and stored it all. They met in the kitchen, still warm from the freshly baked bread. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him suspiciously. "What can a cook say to a man like you, Monsieur Poirot?" "Much more than you think, madam. You see, you hear, you notice when the air changes," she sighed. "I've worked here since before Helena and Charles were married. I know this house better than my own bones. And you know what I've learned? That secret smell, like stale bread. They linger in corners, waiting for someone to bring them out into the open." Poirot smiled. "So tell me, who is leaving a trail of stale bread?" Hargreaves approached the oven and lowered his voice. "Miss Amélie. She was always strange, silent, but for the past few weeks she's been disturbed. I heard her talking to herself one night, in French. I didn't know she spoke French. Do you remember what he said? Single words. Silence, guilt, debt. And the most disturbing, the passage is still there. The passage is still there." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Passage? This house has passageways, old service ducts, tunnels leading from one wing to another. They were sealed years ago, but not all of them. Some still exist. And if someone wanted to get into a locked room, I wouldn't need a key," Poirot completed, as if he had just heard a forgotten symphony. The cook nodded, lowering her voice even further. "And the night the boy disappeared, I heard footsteps. Not in the hallways, on the walls." Poirot didn't wait any longer. He immediately went to the office where Pellington kept the old plans of the house. The butler handed them over without resistance, although his face no longer displayed its usual neutrality. There was tension, and something else, protection. Toward whom? The plans were yellowed, marked with handwritten notes. Poirot turned the pages with precision until he found the level of the baby's room. A thin, almost erased line connected the room to an old pantry in the south wing. "A passageway," he whispered with satisfaction. He retraced his steps, crossing the corridors without a word, until he reached the abandoned pantry, now used to store curtains and empty boxes. He removed a shelf. Dust, cobwebs, and behind it a low door, hidden behind a wooden panel. "Ah, there you go." Poirot switched on his flashlight and opened the hatch. The air that emerged smelled of confinement, old plaster, and forgotten secrets. Moved forward carefully. The passage was narrow, barely enough for an adult to crawl through. The walls were marked with damp stains. 6 meters ahead, another panel. Poirot pushed. On the other side, the baby's room rug. Hours later, Poirot called for all the residents of Manor Lacy to gather in the main hall. Charles, Helena, Nigel, Amélie, Pellington, Grace, and Mrs. Hargreaves, each with their expressions frozen in their own version of bewilderment. The storm was beginning to rattle the windows again, as if the house itself was anticipating the inevitable. Poirot stood with the composure of someone who has already solved the enigma, but chooses not to reveal it yet. "My friends, this crime is notable not for its violence, but for its theatricality. A locked room, an empty crib, a doll as a substitute, This isn't an impulsive act. This is a declaration. Helena murmured, barely audible. A statement? Of what? Of guilt, Poirot said softly, but also of legacy. He turned to Amélie, who was digging her nails into the arms of the chair. Mademoiselle, does the phrase sound familiar to you? The passage is still there. She didn't answer. Madame Hargreaves heard it in her voice. That phrase, that explains everything. How someone could have entered an unlocked room. How a doll appeared instead of a child. Charles stood up abruptly. Are you saying that Amélie? Poirot raised a hand. I'm saying someone used the hidden passageway between the pantry and the baby's room, and that someone had personal motives, privileged access, and an obsession with repeats of the past. The room fell into an icy silence. But I can't accuse anyone yet, Poirot continued. Not yet. His gaze passed over each of them slowly. Because there's one piece missing. Just one. And then, as if fate itself obeyed its rhythm, Mrs. Hargreaves stood up. Monsieur Poirot, he said firmly, perhaps I can help you find her. And at that moment, all eyes turned toward her, as if the truth were about to emerge from a furnace that had been sealed for too long. Chapter 7. The Testimony That Burned. The creaking of the floor under Mrs. Hargreaves's weight was louder than usual, perhaps not because of the physical noise, but because she was carrying something much heavier than her body. Knowledge. Poirot said nothing. No one did. Not even Amélie, who, until that moment, had been the most enigmatic figure in the room. Everyone stared at the cook, as if she had suddenly acquired a new and alarming importance. I've kept silent for a long time, Mrs. Hargreaves began, nervously wiping her hands on her apron. Out of fear. Out of loyalty. I don't know. But after seeing Madame Helena's look, I can't keep silent any longer. Speak, madame, Poirot said, calmly. I assure you that everything you say will be treated with the respect that the truth deserves. She nodded and took a deep breath. 2 weeks ago, I found Mademoiselle Amélie crying in the hallway of the guest wing. I approached to offer her water or whatever she needed. She was pale, trembling, and said something I didn't understand at the time. There are things that must be repeated to be broken. Nigel frowned. Helena raised her hand to her lips. Pellington, for the first time, looked down at the ground. I didn't understand what he meant, the cook continued. But I let it go. I thought it was sadness or something more harmless. But that night, that very night, I heard footsteps inside the passage, I swear on my mother's grave, and they weren't rodents or pipes. And you reported it. Charles chimed in, incredulous. Who, sir? You, who barely looks at me when I say good morning? Or the butler who cares more for Amélie than for the house keys? Pellington raised his head. That's not fair. It's not fair for a child to disappear, Mr. Pellington, she replied firmly. Poirot raised a hand. Silence again. Madam, anything else? Anything you haven't told us yet? She hesitated. Then she nodded. The next day, I went to clean out the south wing pantry, and as I was moving a box to get to the spare curtains, I saw something. A child's handkerchief. Sky blue, with the initials TF hand-stitched on it. A shudder ran through Helena. Theo, she whispered. It's Theo's, my son's. Poirot looked at her closely. Then he turned to Hargreaves. "Where is that handkerchief? Now, I kept it in my room. I thought maybe it was better not to say anything until I understood what was going on. But now I understand." Poirot approached her slowly, with the gravity of a surgeon before cutting. "Do you understand what, madame? That someone wanted that child to disappear, and not out of hatred, out of repetition, out of a twisted idea of redemption. As if by making another child suffer, a previous sin could be cleansed." The detective closed his eyes for a moment. "That's it," he whispered. "An inverted atonement." When Mrs. Hargreaves returned with the paper-wrapped handkerchief, Poirot received it with gloves. He unfolded it carefully. The initials were embroidered in gold thread. The hem showed a stain that looked fresh. "Can you identify this stain, madam?" asked Poirot, pointing to the edge. "Tomato sauce, probably. We had pasta the day before. The boy had been playing with the tablecloth. I remember because the nanny asked me for some stain remover." Poirot nodded. "And yet the handkerchief appears in the pantry, next to the secret passage." "I have no explanation," she said, lowering her head. "But I do," said Poirot. Everyone turned to him. The handkerchief was used as proof of life, not necessarily by the person who devised the plan, but by the person who executed the most dangerous part, the transfer, the physical movement of the child. Because, my friends, not all criminals are brains. Some are hands. And in this house, there's someone who has been both for a long time without being noticed." He turned to Pellington. "Where exactly were you between 6 and 7 that night?" Pellington seemed to swallow the question. His voice came out low. "Preparing the tray in the kitchen. Alone? Mrs. Hargreaves can attest to that. All the time?" She hesitated. "He went out for a moment. He said he was going to check the woodshed." Poirot turned slowly towards him. "But you didn't go to the shed, monsieur. You used the passageway, and not to kidnap the child. To hand him over Pellington is a pipuso. I didn't do it out of malice. I did it because I believed it was the right thing to do." Helena jumped up. "Where is my son?" Pellington, now pale, was trembling. "He's alive! He's safe! Amélie convinced me to take him away, just for a few days. She said Helena needed a break, that if the boy disappeared, she would react and break the cycle, that it was for his own good." Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. Ah, the criminal's pity is always the most dangerous. Amélie didn't move. She remained seated. But her lips murmured something that only Poirot could read. The repetition has been broken, and although not everything had been said yet, it was already clear to everyone that the curtain was beginning to fall. Only the final act remained. Chapter 8. Where Silence Sleeps. Tension was a physical presence in the great hall of Manor Lacey. Helena clutched her son's handkerchief like a life-preserver in a sea that had already begun to swallow her up. Charles stood motionless, like a statue sculpted in suppressed rage. Nigel watched from a corner, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Pellington, who was trembling like a tree in a storm. Amélie, on the other hand, had not moved. "Where is my son?" Helena repeated, her voice hoarse. "Where is Theo?" Pellington closed his eyes for a moment. His voice cracked. "In a country house, in the Cotswolds. with a woman I trust. We were supposed to bring him back tomorrow, without anyone knowing what happened, as if it had all been a mistake. A misunderstanding. She's taking good care of him. He's healthy. He's alive. The word vivo it fell into the room like a stone in murky water. No one breathed for a few seconds. Helena collapsed on the sofa, sobbing with a mixture of relief and fury. "And you thought that was enough?" Charles said, approaching the butler. "To make a child disappear on the whim of this woman?" He turned sharply to Amélie. "What kind of monster are you?" She looked up for the first time in minutes. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She spoke calmly, like someone reciting a well-rehearsed prayer. A monster who wanted to prevent who wanted to break the cycle. The blood of this family is sick. Charles's father beat his wife. Helena's uncle threw himself into the estate's well. My mother talked to walls. How much longer would we keep repeating it? How much longer could we pretend everything was okay? Poirot watched her closely. His small grey cells processed every word, every pause, every glance exchanged in the room. "And then you thought that by removing the child," he said in a low but firm voice, "you could clean up the inheritance, cut the thread. Isn't that right?" Amélie nodded. "Yes, I thought that if Helena thought she'd lost him, she'd learn to fight for him, to protect him from everything, even her own lineage. And if she didn't, if she gave up, then I'd be right." Helena looked up, tears streaming down her face. What if he died of fear? What if we never got him back? "It wasn't the plan," Amélie replied softly. "The plan was to wake up." Poirot approached slowly. "You're not crazy, mademoiselle, but you're dangerously misguided. Your desire for redemption has been disguised as justice. But it was control, manipulation, and cowardice. You going to arrest me, Monsieur Poirot? Not me, but the law, yes. Although perhaps with compassion. Because what he did wasn't for money, or out of hatred. It was out of fear." Charles intervened, tense. Fear or not, she made my son disappear. And that man helped her. Poirot turned to him. "You have a part to play too, monsieur. You raise this house as a temple of pride, not as a home. Amélie acted wrongly, yes, but she found fertile ground here. The room was left in a strange balance. A pendulum stopped just before the blow. So what now?" Helena whispered. Poirot approached her. "Now, madame, let's go get your son. I'll escort you myself." That same afternoon, Poirot, Helena, and 2 agents headed to the cottage Pellington had indicated. It was on a wooded hillside, surrounded by oak trees. A serene-faced elderly woman greeted them. In her arms, a child was fast asleep, with the same expression as Helena's when she rested. As she took him in her arms, Helena let out a low moan, not from pain, but from a reunion that hurt more than the separation. Poirot looked on in silence, and he thought, as he often did at the end of every case, that crime is never an end. It's a crack, and some cracks don't close. You just learn to carry them. Back at Manor Lacy, the police gently led Amélie away. She offered no resistance. Pellington, on the other hand, asked to stay until Helena gave him permission. Without looking at him, she simply said, "Do it, but then leave. Don't come back." Charles locked himself in his office. Nigel left the next day. The house, as always, fell silent, and Poirot, packing his things, took one last look at the child's room. The crib was back in its place. The repaired mobile turned slowly in the breeze that came in through the open window. Repetition is not broken by fear, Poirot murmured, but with love and truth. And with that thought he left, because the case was solved, but the wounds not yet. Chapter 9. The Cracks Beneath the Veil. A week later, the rain had stopped falling on Manor Lacey, but the air remained damp with the unspoken. The case had been declared closed by the authorities. Theo had been found safe and sound, the culprits identified, and the motive, though disturbing, was not criminally malevolent according to the initial psychiatric report. Amélie Lemoine had been transferred to a specialized clinic. Pellington, with quiet discretion, had left the house for good. But Hercule Poirot had not left, not yet. Despite the apparent resolution, something still didn't quite fit in his mind. One piece, a very small one, perhaps insignificant one, still didn't fit, and Poirot, the smallest detail, haunted him like a speck of dust on a white tablecloth. Sitting in the conservatory that afternoon, a cup of tea in front of him, Poirot leafed through his notebook. Words enclosed in boxes, arrows, margins covered with notes. Psychological motivation is not completely linear. Charles's reaction, too calculated. Why didn't Helena close the window that night? What if the doll wasn't Amélie's idea? Helena appeared at the threshold of the greenhouse, looking paler, but somewhat more determined than in previous days. She was carrying Theo in her arms. The child was sleeping soundly, wrapped in a pearly grey blanket. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, calmly, "you've done so much for us. I can't thank you enough." Poirot stood up, bowed slightly, and offered her a chair. "How are you feeling, madam?" "Broken," she admitted, "but I'm starting to find my feet, like a vase that someone's patiently trying to glue back together." There was a brief silence. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves rustling in the wind outside the glass. "Madam," Poirot said delicately, "I'd like to ask you one more question. Not as a detective, but as a man who observes the crevices of the human soul. Of course. Did you love Amélie?" Helena thought for a moment. Then she nodded, her eyes moist. "Yes. In a complex, painful way, but yes. He was my shadow my whole life. And when a shadow leaves, you realize that part of your form disappears with it." Poirot nodded, moved by the honesty, but his eyes never left the sleeping child's face. "And yet," he added gently, "when Theo disappeared, you knew deep down that he was alive, didn't you?" Helena hesitated. "Yes, I didn't mean to say it, but I felt it. Not as a certainty, but as an incomplete absence." Poirot put the cup on the table. And that night, when he found the empty crib, the window was closed, but not completely locked. The latch had been forced open from the inside, but there were no marks on the outside. "I checked it myself. What does he insinuate, Monsieur Poirot?" "I'm not insinuating. I'm observing. I deduce that someone wanted simulate a confinement. Not an impossible crime, but a scene that seemed like it. A theatrical scene." Helena tensed. "Are you saying it wasn't just Amélie?" Poirot stood up slowly. "I'm saying that someone in this house understood perfectly well that the only way you would fight for your son was if you felt you might lose him, and that this someone had access to Amelie's emotions, her history, her traumas, and knew how to channel them, maybe without directing it, but yes, by provoking it." Helena looked down. Theo mumbled something in his sleep and held on tighter to his mother. "Charles," she finally whispered. "Right?" Poirot didn't reply. He just came over and placed his hand on hers. "I'm not accusing, madam. I'm just asking questions. Some, perhaps, you've already asked." Helena took a deep breath. Her eyes were dry. Charles didn't want the child, but he knew he had to pretend he did. He pressured him all the time. About his future, about his last name. Sometimes he talked about his lineage, as if it were a curse, or a heavy suitcase. I always knew he didn't fully accept it. Then perhaps, Poirot said softly, someone like Amélie was the perfect instrument. Emotionally volatile, impressive, and faithful. And useful, Helena added bitterly, until it wasn't. Perhaps, said Poirot, but now she's far away. And Charles, he hasn't said a word since everything came to light. Where is he? He's travelled to London. On political matters, he said. But he hasn't asked about Theo. Not once. Poirot closed his notebook. He no longer needed to write, "Madam, I wish you peace, and I wish you strength." Because rebuilding isn't just about starting over. It's about knowing which parts shouldn't be put back together. Helena walked him to the entrance. Theo was still asleep, but as he stepped outside, a ray of sunlight touched his face, and his lips curved slightly. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," Helena said, "for everything." He paused before getting into his car. "Oh, and madam, if your son ever asks you to tell him this story, don't talk to him about fear. Talk to him about courage." And so, Hercule Poirot left, not with satisfaction, not even with relief, but with the certainty that, although the culprits had been identified, the most difficult inheritance was yet to be broken, that of silence. Chapter 10. The Echo of the Past. 2 weeks later, London bustled under a leaden sky. The streets, drenched by an inconstant rain, reflected the grey architecture and the indifferent pace of a city unsettled by domestic tragedies. In a discreet building, a few steps from Parliament, a tall man with a square jaw and an impeccably tailored coat paced his office, Charles Farnley. The blinds were half open, the desk spotless. An untouched cup of tea was cooling next to a closed folder. Inside were copies of police reports, psychiatric extracts, and a sealed letter. The letter Helena never opened. The letter he wrote the night Theo disappeared. A sharp knock on the door brought him out of his trance. Yeah, an assistant came in. Young, nervous, in an ill-fitting suit. "Monsieur Hercule Poirot is here to see you, Mr. Farnley." Charles didn't blink. "Send him in." Poirot entered with his usual elegant gait, his hat in his hand, his gloves neatly tucked away. His expression was cordial and cold. "Monsieur Farnley, how unexpected to find you in such good health. And so busy." "I'm in the middle of a parliamentary session, Monsieur Poirot. To what do I owe your visit?" "Oh, just a question I left in my suitcase. One last question." An untied knot, Charles smirked, but his eyes didn't reflect the same calm. "Are you still obsessed with the Manor Lacey affair? I thought you'd already solved it brilliantly and with applause." Poirot walked up to the desk without asking permission. He looked at the neatly arranged papers. "I've solved it, yes, but not all solutions are written in official reports. Some are written in the conscience." Charles settled into his seat. "Are you accusing me of something, Monsieur Poirot?" "No, I just came to ask you something simple." "And what would that be?" Poirot stared at him. "Did you know what Amélie was planning?" The silence spread like ink in water. Charles didn't respond immediately. Then he leaned forward. "What if I knew? What would change? I wasn't the one who crossed the passage. I wasn't the one who dressed the doll. I wasn't the one who manipulated the nanny. And yet, here I am, in the invisible dock of her judgment." Poirot narrowed his eyes. "There is no judgment, monsieur. There is only truth. You knew Helena wouldn't confront you directly. You knew Amélie was unstable. You knew that a nudge, a suggestion, a veiled comment would all it took for the catastrophe to begin on its own. You think everything can be explained with logic, that we're chess pieces. But sometimes, Monsieur Poirot, life is a labyrinth, not a chessboard. Maybe. But even in a maze, monsieur, there are entrances and exits. And you chose not to stop her. You chose to look the other way. Or worse, you chose for it to happen." Charles clenched his fists on the desk. His voice lowered. "I didn't want her to hurt him. Just to realize how fragile everything was. Helena lives in a cloud of illusory morality. She doesn't understand that the name Farnley is a burden, that the child, though innocent, is the continuation of something that drags us all down." Poirot moved a little closer. His voice was barely a whisper. And in their twisted logic, allowing him to disappear was a way of controlling him, of proving that he could still manipulate fate. "I didn't touch the child," Charles repeated mechanically. "I didn't touch the child." "But you touched fear," Poirot replied, "and that, monsieur, is just as dangerous." The two men looked at each other for a moment. Then Poirot stepped back and adjusted his hat. "I won't report him. The law has already done its part. But believe me, the child will grow up. And lies always find their way back." Charles didn't respond. He just stood there, rigid, like a figure carved from stone. Poirot left without another word. On the train home, as the lights of the English countryside flashed past the window, Poirot took out his notebook once more. He wrote, "Justice isn't always dressed in a toga. Sometimes it's disguised as consistency." Then he closed the notebook and leaned back slightly in his seat. The case of the empty cradle was over. But the echo would continue to resonate. Chapter 11. The letter that was never sent. The train moved forward at a steady pace. A murmur of steel on rails that accompanied Poirot's thoughts like a repeated score. London was behind him, but not the trail of the case. Although the truth had been revealed and the pieces of the crime assembled with surgical logic, the Belgian knew, as always, that the true outcome didn't occur in the courtroom, nor in the headlines, but in the silences that followed, in what wasn't said, in what still hurt. He carefully put away his notebook and took an envelope from his inside coat pocket. It was old, folded. The seal was already broken. In the corner, in barely faded blue ink, one could read for Helena when it's too late. C.F. Poirot had found the letter on Charles's desk during his visit, carefully hidden between pages of a report. Not stolen, no. Simply forgotten, or perhaps abandoned. He didn't usually read other people's correspondence, but there was something about that letter, something in its title, that seemed like another piece of the emotional puzzle that formal justice didn't cover. He unfolded it and read, "My dear Helena, if you're reading this, it's because something has already happened, something we both knew was coming, but we pretended not to see. I don't know if Theo is still with us or not. I don't know if you've broken up or gotten stronger. But I know something broke inside me a long time ago, and I never knew how to tell you. I didn't want to be a father, not really. Not because I don't love children, although I'm not sure I understand them, but because I always knew my heritage was tainted, that carrying the Farnley name was like dragging a rusty chain attached to your soul. My father taught me that, and his, it seems, taught him. When Amélie began to talk about repetitions, family curses, mistakes reborn with different faces, something resonated inside me, as if someone finally understood what I couldn't explain. I didn't incite her, but I didn't stop her. Does that make me guilty? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just a coward. I witnessed a fire I didn't start, but I didn't try to put out either. This letter isn't seeking forgiveness. I don't deserve it. It's simply meant to record that some part of me, the smallest perhaps, did want everything to be okay. That you and Theo would be safe. I just didn't know how to make room for that part without destroying myself. Completely. If you can ever forgive me, don't do it for me. Do it for him. Because children deserve to grow up free from their parents' past. Charles. Poirot lowered the letter slowly, his expression inscrutable. The train continued on its way, crossing mist-covered meadows. Folding the paper delicately, Poirot placed it in a new, unstamped envelope. On the back, he wrote just one word: delivered. It wasn't her place to judge what Helena would do with it. Maybe she'd tear it up. Maybe she'd save it for Theo to read someday. Maybe she'd never open it at all. But it was his. That afternoon, upon arriving at his London apartment, Poirot handed the envelope to the doorman with a note. For Mrs. Farnley. Personal, complete discretion. Would you like me to sign a receipt, Monsieur Poirot? It's not necessary. The truth doesn't always need a signature, just a destination. Days later, at Manor Lacy, Helena received a package with no return address. She opened it cautiously, immediately recognizing Poirot's handwriting in the single word sealed within. She read it alone, without tears, without anger, only with an old-fashioned tiredness, that of someone who has held up an entire building on her shoulders. When she finished, she went out into the garden, where Theo was playing with a branch turned into a sword. The boy looked up at her, smiled, and ran toward her. "Mother!" Helena hugged him tightly, tighter than necessary, and she whispered without him understanding, "I won't do it again. I won't do it again. I won't do it again. because that was the real ending of the case. Not the revelation, but the decision, if not to be like them. Chapter 12. The Legacy of the Empty Cradle. Spring arrived without ceremony. The lawns at Manor Lacey were timidly greening, as if still doubting their right to return to life. The camellias bloomed silently near the pond, and in the greenhouse the orchids opened one by one, as if finally remembering they were alive. But inside the house the air was still thick with absences. Helena had begun to move more steadily, like someone relearning to walk after a long confinement in her own body. Every corner she crossed brought back a memory, but also an opportunity to rewrite it. She had given instructions to remove the crib from the room. In its place she placed a low chair, a hand-woven wool rug, and a small shelf of storybooks. Theo now slept in a new room, in the south wing, away from the scene that had been decorated as a shrine and then became his temporary tomb. Helena spent mornings with him in the garden, reading him stories under the magnolia tree. Sometimes he asked her to tell him the story of the boy who hid so well that even his mother had to search with all her love to find him. And although she never used real names, nor mentioned passageways or dolls, she always included the same lesson. And then the mother understood that fear wouldn't protect her, that she had to trust and look to her son not as an echo of the past, but as the first word of the future. Theo listened to her, his head resting on her lap, his fingers tangled in the fabric of her dress. It was their ritual, a way of undoing the trauma, thread by thread. One afternoon, Helena received an unexpected visitor. It was Mrs. Hargreaves, who, following the investigation, had taken an indefinite leave of absence. She had no suitcases, no expectations, just a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I'm not here to stay, madame," he said as he entered. "I'm just here to deliver something I've kept hidden for too long." Helena invited her into the living room. There was no resentment in her tone, just an unsettling calm, like stagnant water. The cook placed the package on the table and opened it. Inside was an object Helena didn't expect to see again. The doll, the same one he'd found dressed in his son's clothes. Her glass eyes still shone with their involuntary cruelty, with their opaque silence. The police had it, but they returned it to me by mistake. It's been in my room ever since. I didn't know what to do with it. I thought about burning it, but then I thought maybe you'd know how to lock everything up." Helena stared at her. Then she nodded. She took the doll in her firm hands and stood up. "Come with me." They walked to the edge of the garden, where a small plot of land was cleared. There, under the shade of an ash tree, Helena began to dig. It wasn't easy. The damp earth yielded slowly, but after a few minutes she had formed a deep enough hole. She placed the doll inside. Then she added something else. A neatly folded letter, the one Poirot had sent her. "I don't want Theo to find her in the attic one day," he explained, "or inherit ill-disguised ghosts. This is where they should rest." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded. They both filled the gap in silence, shovelful by shovelful. When they finished, Helena took a small white stone and placed it on top. "It's not a grave," he said. "It's a witness." "Of what, madam?" "That we tried. that in the midst of the horror, someone still chose not to repeat it. That night, while Theo slept soundly, Helena wrote one last letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't dated. It wasn't signed either. It just said, "There are things that are inherited unintentionally. Fears, secrets, silences, but you can also inherit the courage to break them." He won't remember the terror. He'll only know that we were looking for him, that we loved him, that we didn't leave him alone. And that will be enough. He placed it inside a storybook. He put it on the bookshelf, on the third shelf, next to the teddy bear, which was now spinning in its place. Far away, in his London apartment, Poirot read the newspaper with his usual cup of chamomile tea. In the society section, a small note went almost unnoticed. The Farnley family announces they will not be attending this year's parliamentary gala. Personal recovery issues, the statement reads. Poirot smiled slightly, and he muttered to himself, "Sometimes justice is a child who sleeps peacefully again." With that, he closed the newspaper, straightened his moustache, and began thinking about his next case. Because even when the cradle is full again, the world keeps turning, and Hercule Poirot too. Chapter 13. A Voice from the Mirror. A serene afternoon enveloped London in its golden hue, when Poirot, back in his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, received an envelope with no return address. It was made of thick, cream-coloured paper, with slightly frayed edges, as if it had travelled much longer than the postal service allowed. He examined it carefully. No official stamp, no letterhead, just his name, Mr. Hercule Poirot, written in elegant but shaky handwriting. He opened the envelope with the same thoroughness with which he dissected alibis. Inside was a short letter, very short. "Mr. Poirot, there's something else, something didn't say, something Helena doesn't know. I'm not asking for redemption, but if you're going to close this case in your memory as one of the solved ones, I beg you, come visit me." A Poirot leaned back in his armchair, carefully crossed one leg, and rested the envelope on his knee. The verb tense in the letter caught his attention. "I have something to say, but there's something I didn't say. Impersonal, distant, and yet urgent. Amélie Lemoine." The next day, Poirot took a car to St. Briavel's clinic, on the outskirts of Bath, a secluded spot amidst gentle hills and silent woods. The building was made of pale stone, with the air of a country boarding school rather than a psychiatric institution. Upon arrival, he was greeted by a nurse who seemed to be expecting him. "Miss Lemoine has mentioned it every day, monsieur," she said with a smile that seemed to weigh more than it should. "She doesn't talk much, but when she does, she talks about you." Poirot nodded, not complacent, just focused. They led him to a small, bright room. Inside, sitting by an open window, was Amélie. Her face was thinner, her cheeks marked by a lingering pallor, but her eyes remained the same, intense, distant, as if inhabiting a parallel world. "Mademoiselle," said Poirot softly, taking off his hat. She turned. She smiled. It was a faint smile, like the reflection of something that was no longer there. "I knew you were coming." Poirot sat opposite her. The breeze stirred a linen curtain. On the windowsill, a sparrow watched without moving. "I received your letter. And you came to hear a confession?" "No," said Poirot. I came to seek the ultimate truth, the one that has yet to be named." Amélie closed her eyes for a moment. Then she spoke. "I didn't plan everything, but I did want it." Poirot watched her calmly. "The kidnapping? No, the loss. I wanted the boy to be lost. Not forever, not physically. But I wanted him to vanish from Helena's world for a while, to see if her love would endure. And if he didn't, then you would have been right." "About what?" "About the love that isn't taught, but rather repeated like a pattern. I thought Helena only loved what made her feel strong, and I feared that Theo was just a symbol, the heir, the correction of a family past." Poirot bowed slightly. "And what did you discover?" She looked at him, and for the first time her eyes filled with tears. "That I was wrong." Poirot waited. "When I saw her walk into the room and see the empty crib, she didn't scream like I imagined. She didn't curse. She didn't cry out to heaven for help. She just fell to the floor and stayed there, as if her soul had been broken. I knew then I'd made a mistake, that her love wasn't symbolic. It was real." Poirot nodded silently. "It's not easy to admit that, mademoiselle." "No," she whispered. "Even less so when one has built oneself on doubt. But there's something else, monsieur." Poirot encouraged her with his eyes. "I wasn't the one who dressed the doll. The silence was absolute." "No," she said, "that was a decision beyond my control. I only suggested the child disappear for a while. Pellington acted, but that doll, it wasn't his idea. It was placed there as a cruel irony, as a mockery. Someone else intended for Helena to suffer twice as much, for the child not only to be missing, but to appear to be replaced." Poirot frowned. "Do you know who?" Amélie nodded slowly. "I have no proof, but in a conversation I was never supposed to hear, Charles mentioned something to Pellington. Something like, 'Do it right, make it noticeable.' I thought he meant the transfer, but now I think that's what he was talking about. The symbol, the doll. Poirot closed his eyes for a moment. The complete picture was there, finally. The crime, yes, but also the intention. Charles's coldness wasn't just an omission, it was a design. That night, Poirot wrote in his diary, "Sometimes the real villain isn't the one who acts, but the one who creates the perfect framework for others to do it for them." Charles Farnley didn't need to lift a hand. He just sewed and waited. But Theo is safe. Helena has awakened, and Amélie has begun to look at her reflection without hatred. That, perhaps, is all that can be achieved in this imperfect world. And on the next page he wrote down the title of the case, "The Empty Crib in the Locked Room." He closed the newspaper, and for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. Chapter 14. The Missing Picture. 2 months passed. During that time, the story of Manor Lacy, one that had never made headlines or appeared clearly in the newspapers, faded from the social murmur like a shadow fleeing the sun. No one asked about Amélie Lemoine any more. Charles Farnley, his political astuteness intact, avoided discussing the matter, citing postnatal stress in his wife and a family reorganization. Helena, for her part, had withdrawn completely from public life, concentrating on Theo, the garden, and silence. But Poirot had not closed the case completely. There are crimes that are resolved by law, and others that are resolved by the soul. That one, he thought, still owed one last truth, and that truth, curiously, wasn't in a document or in a confession or in a police statement. It was in a painting. Poirot revisited Lacey Manor one clear June morning. He had previously written to Helena, and his invitation to return was brief, but sincere. "Monsieur Poirot, you are always welcome in this house. Theo is asking for you." He was greeted by Grace, the nanny, who now seemed more serene, as if some of the tension that had previously oppressed her shoulders had dissipated. The butler had been replaced, and the kitchen no longer smelled of repression, but of freshly baked bread. In the drawing-room, Helena was waiting for him. She was dressed in white, simple. Her face was no longer that of a victim. It was that of a woman who had begun to understand her ruins. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Thank you, madam. I'm not here as a detective this time." "So what's that? Like someone who needs to confirm a theory, not to solve a crime, but to understand an inheritance." She tilted her head curiously. Poirot pointed to one of the walls, where family portraits hung. There were the Farnleys, a straight line of men and women, all with the same air of severity, the same deep-set eyes, the same tight mouth. "Look, madam, there's an empty space." Helena looked at him, and she understood instantly. "Ah, Charles's portrait. Yes, he's gone. I had it taken down," she said calmly. "I hung it up for years out of habit. But recently I realized all it did was remind me of his coldness. And Theo, I don't want him to see him every day." Poirot nodded with satisfaction. That portrait was the frame, the symbol of power and legacy, of the dynasty, the true testament of the house. Removing it was more than a gesture. It was a choice. She sighed. The Farnleys always believed their story redeemed them, but no, it only chained them. Poirot looked at her tenderly. "Confirmation. He's fine, happy, I'd say. He talks about you as if you were some kind of magician. He says you made his fear disappear." Poirot smiled. "No, no. The fear is still there. What we did was give it a name, and when you name the monster, it stops growing." Helena approached the window. Theo was playing with a kite in the field. The sky was blue. The boy was laughing. And Charles. He's still in London, with his projects. His ambition hasn't stopped. It's just changed shape. "Are you afraid of them?" Helena thought. Then she shook her head. "No, not any more, because now I know that his power was only a reflection of the fear he sowed, and I no longer water that soil." Poirot stood up. "So, madam, the case is truly solved." She walked him to the door. In the hall, a new painting hung where Charles's portrait had once been. It was a child's watercolour, with clumsy shapes and bold colours, a tree, a huge sun, a child with open arms. In the bottom corner, Theo, 4 years old. "Bon," said Poirot with a slight bow. "Now that's a legacy worth hanging up." That night in his apartment, Poirot wrote one last line in his diary. The locked room wasn't the one where the crime took place. It was the heart of a family, and the key was the courage to break with the past. He closed the notebook. He turned off the light, and satisfied for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sleep without dreaming. Chapter 15. The Last Footprints. Life had returned to Manor Lacey, but not the same life. It was a more sober, more conscious version, as if the house had aged in spirit after Theo's disappearance and Charles's fall into obscurity. The routines continued, but with a different rhythm. The clocks still ticked, but without the rigid precision that had once governed the mansion. Poirot hadn't returned since his last visit, but like any good detective and any good observer of human nature, he knew that stories don't end with the resolution of the crime. They end, if anything, when those touched by it learn to live with what remains. However, a letter called him, again, this time not from Helena, but of Nigel Farnley. Mr. Poirot, I'm writing to you from Cornwall, where I've temporarily retired following recent events. I know you've already closed the case, at least formally, but there's something I need to tell you, something that's been festering under the rug in this family for years. I'm not looking for redemption, only perhaps a voice that doesn't look at me through the eyes of lineage. If you can, come. If not, at least know that the crime at Manor Lacey wasn't the first, just the most visible. Nigel Poirot arrived 2 days later. The Cornish landscape offered a dramatic contrast to the Farnleys' tidy gardens. Here, the sea crashed against the cliffs without asking permission, and the houses seemed built not from stone, but from accumulated memory. Nigel lived in a simple, isolated cabin with a roaring fireplace and a single room filled with books stacked like barricades. He greeted him with a pre-poured glass of whiskey and the expression of someone who'd lived too long with a badly buried secret. "Thanks for coming," he said bluntly. "I didn't know who else to tell this to." "You honour me with your confidence, monsieur," replied Poirot, sitting down, crossing one leg neatly. Nigel ran a hand through his hair, and for a few seconds he said nothing. Finally, staring into the fire, he began to speak. "My father didn't die in an accident, Monsieur Poirot. It was Charles who found him hanged in the greenhouse, but it was always said to have been heart failure, a fainting spell, a miscalculated fall." Poirot said nothing. He just waited. "I saw him, that night, from the attic window. I saw Charles cut the rope. I saw his face. And I also saw that he didn't cry or scream. He just bent down, took my father's pocket watch and put it in his coat. Then he called the doctor. Not another word. Why did you never say it? Because I was 13, and because Charles was already Charles. I didn't accuse him, but I never trusted him again. And when we grew up, I stayed away, very far away. And now you feel like everything fits together." Nigel nodded. "I always thought his cruelty was a shield. But what he did to Helena, what he allowed with Theo, it was a repetition, not of an act, of a pattern. Charles didn't kill with his hands. He killed with control." Poirot nodded slowly. "There are men who don't shed blood, but they do bleed, and that leaves no trace in the reports." Nigel poured himself another drink. He didn't offer one. I knew I couldn't tell him before. It wouldn't have changed anything. But now, I want someone else to know. So I'm not the only one burdened with this. "You understand, monsieur," said Poirot gently. "But I'll tell you something else." Nigel raised his eyes, tired. His silence, though cowardly in his youth, was what allowed him to stay out of it. And that's perhaps why Theo now had someone in the family who doesn't pose a threat. Someday, that will be valuable. Nigel didn't respond, but his shoulders seemed to release an invisible weight. Poirot returned to London with the sea still roaring. In his ear, in his diary, he wrote, "The visible crime was a doll in an empty cradle. The real one was a life governed by a mission." Charles Farnley didn't kill with guns, but he may have inherited a whole house of silences. And silences, when repeated, kill. Nigel survived not because he was stronger, but because he witnessed it, and he chose to remain silent. Today, by speaking out, he's become human again. Poirot closed the notebook. He looked at his watch. It was late, but the footprints, although old, were finally complete, and some truths, even if they arrive late, they close what justice cannot. Chapter 16. The Silence Under the Rug. The days following his visit to Cornwall were marked by an eerie calm. Hercule Poirot had returned to his apartment at Whitehaven Mansions, but something of the sea mist, of Nigel Farnley's broken whisper, had stayed with him. The case was, from every legal and logical angle, solved. And yet, an echo lingered, a murmur that said there is still something else. Poirot's instinct was rarely wrong, and it wasn't vanity, although he himself candidly admitted that there was some of that, but a developed sensitivity to detect the gap between words, and now that void pointed to a place that hadn't yet been questioned. A corner of the Farnley house that, curiously, no one had mentioned. The father's office. That same week, Poirot sent a short letter to Helena. "Madame, I've noticed that in our many conversations, the late Mr. Edwin Farnley's office was never mentioned. Would it be too presumptuous to ask for access to it?" Helena responded almost immediately. "Monsieur Poirot, my late father-in-law's office has remained locked since his death. Charles never allowed anyone to touch it. Not even I entered more than once. But if you feel you must enter, the key is at your disposal." And so Poirot returned to Manor Lacy, this time alone. The house seemed different, not because of the furniture or the decor, but because of the energy it radiated. Less pretentious, more honest. Even the corridors, which had previously seemed rigid with protocol, now creaked as if breathing. Helena greeted him with a faint smile, and silently led him toward the west wing. There, behind a heavy walnut door, was Edwin Farnley's office. "It is," Helena said. "It was never part of my life. It's a shrine that Charles was determined to leave untouched." Poirot nodded. He took the key. He inserted it and opened it. The interior was dim. The curtains were closed. The air was heavy. An antique desk occupied the centre of the room. On it, a lamp with a green leather shade, an ebony quill pen, a dried-out inkwell, and an open book. Poirot approached slowly. He didn't touch anything yet. His eyes scanned the details. A sepia portrait of Edwin Farnley with his 2 young sons, a crystal goblet with sediment in the bottom, a Persian rug with its edges slightly rolled up, and a bookcase lined with leather-bound volumes. Then he saw what he was looking for, a black leather folder with the inscription Personal, E.F. He opened it with gloves. Inside were old newspaper clippings, typewritten letters, and at the end an unstamped envelope. Inside, a handwritten letter. Signed Edwin Farnley. He read it carefully. To whoever finds this letter, if you're reading this, it's because I haven't had the courage to destroy it, nor the hope of correcting it. Charles is not my son. My wife cheated on me, just once, she claims, with a man who worked in the stables, a man named Branton. By the time Charles was born, I knew, but I decided to raise him as Farnley. I kept quiet, as they always keep quiet in this family, but that silence has poisoned me. Charles was always different, not cruel, but cold, as if he knew he didn't quite belong. He doesn't know this truth. No one does, not even Nigel. Maybe I shouldn't care. But every time I see him look at his mother with that judgment in his eyes, every time I hear him talk about blood, lineage, and legacy, I feel like this secret is the real crime. If the day ever comes when someone must understand why Charles acts the way he does, this is the answer. He's not Farnley, not by blood, by name only, and sometimes that's the worst thing you can be. Edwin Farnley Poirot slowly closed the letter. His face was a mask of control, but inside the grey cells were throbbing wildly, not because of the scandal, not because of the revelation, but because of it, the contempt for the child, the need to control him, the coldness toward Helena, the manipulation of Amélie. Charles didn't just carry the legacy, he tried to claim by force, because, deep down, he knew he didn't belong to him, and instead of accepting it, he turned it into an obsession. Poirot stood up. He left the office. Helena was waiting for him in the corridor. "Did you find anything?" He hesitated. Then he simply said, "Yes, but nothing to worry about, just one less shadow, a more visible crack. Do you want me to close it?" "No, madame, leave it open. Sometimes letting the light in is the only thing you can do with certain secrets." That night, Poirot didn't write in his notebook. He didn't jot down any sentences. He didn't underline any thoughts. He just watched the silence. Because now the puzzle was complete. The locked room had contained many things. A baby, a doll, a still mobile. But above all, generations of hidden truths. And now, finally, silence had also spoken. Chapter 17. The Curse of the Name. The day after discovering Edwin Farnley's letter, Poirot took the train back to London, with the document tucked away between the pages of his diary. He had no intention of giving it to anyone. Not Helena, not Nigel, not even Charles. The truth was there, yes, dark, overwhelming. But not all truths heal. Some, as the Belgian detective well knew, only reopen the wounds that time had managed to sew with imperfect threads. And yet, the discovery wasn't something he could dismiss. It was the final piece of a psychological puzzle that had enveloped the entire Farnley family like a fog that, at its source, was nothing more than a lie with a proper name. A week later, Poirot received an unexpected invitation. Charles Farnley invited him to a private luncheon at his London residence. The tone of the letter was cordial, even courteous, but behind the words, Poirot sensed a subtle tension. It wasn't a friendly invitation. Rather, It was a meeting between two men who knew they were on the same page, but hadn't yet said it out loud. Charles's Kensington home was modern and cold, with Italian furniture and immaculate white walls, almost surgical. The host greeted Poirot with a strained smile and offered him a seat in a living room decorated, as if it had never been lived in. "Monsieur Poirot," Charles said, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "I was wondering how long it would take you to get back." "Oh, monsieur," replied Poirot, accepting the glass but not drinking. "I didn't come back. The case was already closed, only the echo wasn't over." "The echo?" "Oui, the one that bounces in the corridors of blood, or the lack thereof." Charles stared at him. Then he smiled, but his eyes didn't share his smile. "So you've read my father's letter?" Poirot was not surprised, didn't expect it, but it didn't surprise me. Charles leaned back in the chair and took a sip. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't making excuses. "And now, what will you do with that information?" Poirot crossed his legs elegantly. "Nothing, because the real punishment, Monsieur Farnley, won't come from me. It will come from within." Charles laughed softly. "Do you know what my first memory was? My mother telling me I was a real Farnley. She repeated it like a mantra, as if saying it made it true." Poirot watched him in silence. "I grew up believing I had to be better than everyone. Colder, stronger, more accurate. Because if I wasn't, maybe someone would notice. Maybe someone would see that I wasn't entirely legitimate." Then he realized that the most effective thing was to take control. Charles nodded. "Always. Control the narrative, the story, the house, Helena, Amélie, the child. Not because I hated them, but because if I didn't control them, they might tear down the facade." Poirot put the glass on the table. "But, sir, you're not the only one who's inherited a lie. We all do, in some way. What differentiates men is whether they allow that lie to turn them into a distorted version of themselves, or whether they face it and break the cycle." Charles looked at him for a long time. "And you think I can break it now? It's not for me to believe, only for you. But I'll tell you this. Theo doesn't know who he is yet, and he can still learn that the name he bears is just a label, not a curse." Charles looked down. "Will you tell Helena?" "No," said Poirot, "because she has already decided to love Theo freely. And that, monsieur, makes him more Farnley than anyone else." The silence that followed was thick but not hostile. It was a silence of truce, of tacit agreement. "Thanks for coming," Charles finally said. "I didn't expect you to." "I did, because I knew you needed to be heard as a human being, not as a surname." Poirot stood up. Charles did not accompany him to the door. That evening, back in his apartment, Poirot wrote his last reflection. The case of the empty cradle was not a mystery of a closed space, but of sealed hearts. The crime was not the disappearance of the child, but the lack of truth in those who were supposed to protect him. The Farnley name was built on secrets. But now, for the first time, what no one dared shout has been quietly spoken, and that's enough. For Theo, for Helena, even for Charles. Poirot closed his newspaper, turned off his desk lamp, and stood for a few minutes looking out the open window. Outside, the city was still breathing, and somewhere a child slept unaware that he would inherit a much cleaner history, because someone finally had dared to tell the truth. Chapter 18. The Last Witness. A week after his last meeting with Charles Farnley, Hercule Poirot received another letter. This time it didn't come from Manor-Lacy, nor from London, nor even from a person with a significant surname. The sender was Grace Willoughby, the young nanny who had been looking after Theo during the brief but decisive episode of the crime. The letter was short, written in black ink on modest paper, but its words carried a weight that exceeded their size. "Mr. Poirot, I've dared to write to you because I believe I've kept silent about something you should know, not out of justice, which you've already served, with elegance, but out of clarity, out of complete truth. The night the boy disappeared, I wasn't in my room as I'd claimed. I went downstairs after hearing a whisper in the hallway. 'Don't cry, everything will be all right.' I recognized Amélie's voice. But as I got closer, I saw another figure. It wasn't Pellington. It was Charles. He didn't flinch at the sight of me. He just said, 'Go to sleep, Grace. This doesn't concern you.' I obeyed, as always. But I knew then that he didn't just know what was going on. He directed it. He controlled it. I don't know what kept me silent the most during these months. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the certainty that no one would believe me. But after everything that's happened, I think you will. Thank you for returning the child, and for returning him to us without hatred. Grace." Poirot read the letter 3 times, not out of doubt, but for confirmation. What he had suspected from his first visit to Manor-Lacy was now concretized by the only voice who had witnessed the key scene. Grace, out of fear or passive loyalty, had covered for Charles. But now she spoke, not to punish, but to liberate. He didn't reply to the letter. There was no need to. In his office, Poirot opened his case diary for the last time. Under the heading, "The Empty Crib in the Locked Room," he wrote with his green fountain pen. All the elements of the mystery were, at first, part of an illusion, a locked room, an impossible disappearance, a doll instead of the child. But when the drama was broken down piece by piece, what remained was not a perfect crime, but a broken-down emotion. Amélie was the fragile mind, Pellington the executing hand, Helena the vulnerable heart, but Charles Farnley was the silent director, the architect of trauma. His crime was bloodless, but it was designed. His motive wasn't inheritance, it was legacy. He didn't wish to kill the boy, but to prove he could shape the world in his image, to create fear, to command emotions, and when he failed, when Helena didn't break, when the boy was loved more strongly than ever, he knew he had lost. And that was punishment enough. Poirot closed the diary with a slight sigh. It was late. Outside, the lights of London twinkled like urban stars, and the air carried the scent of a city that, though changing every day, continued to repeat certain stories. At Manor-Lacy, Theo ran through the garden with a wooden airplane in his hand. His laughter cut through the air like a wordless victory hymn. Helena watched him from the porch, a cup of tea in her hands, a real, not feigned, peace in her eyes. I had made decisions. I had dropped demands. I had severed ties. Charles, no longer lived in the house or been part of the upbringing. The surname was still Farnley, but only as another letter, not as a chain. On the shelf in Theo's room, between cloth books and stuffed animals, sat a small porcelain figurine. A doll, without a dress, without symbolism, a vestige of the past. He had decided not to destroy it, just to render it powerless. As a reminder that what is faced does not dominate again. Days later, Poirot received another envelope. This time it bore no signature, just a drawing, a paper airplane crossing a blue sky. On the back, in childlike handwriting, "Thank you, Mr. Poirot." According to, and that for him was the real closure, because the cradle was no longer empty, and the heart that watched over her finally beat freely.